In this video, you're going to learn how to resize your flex items inside the Flexbox. This means that you're going to be controlling the size of your flex items, so you can make them grow or shrink so that they become flexible. You can also decide to not make them flexible. So let's go ahead and start with our first example. So let's select all the flex items inside the container. So they're all divs inside the elements of class container. And let's use a property called flex grow. This property will specify the rates of growth of each flex item. So each flex item is going to start growing from a specific starting point, which I'm going to explain in a bit. Now, we're going to say that all flex items are going to grow at the same rate, and I'm going to choose a number, for example, 1. Since all flex items have the same growth rate, this means that starting from their starting point, they're going to grow at the same rate. Well, to see this clearly, let's change slightly the content of our flex items. So let's make Apple slightly bigger in content. So the starting point of growth is going to be, in this scenario, the minimum width necessary to fit the content of each flex item. And if you want to find that, you can just reduce the width of your Flexbox or your container until the point where you get a new line. So that's the starting point, and this is the minimum width that is necessary to fit the content of each Flexbox. So the minimum width of Apple is that. And FlexGrow tells us here that we're gonna grow at the same rate, meaning that each of these flex items is gonna start growing from this starting point at exactly the same rate. All right. So what does it mean? It means that if my screen was a lot bigger than this and Facebook became twice its original size, then Microsoft was going to become also twice its original size. And the same applies to all the other flex items. All right. Now let's see what happens when one of these flex items is given a different flex grow. So I'm going to go to Facebook, or let's go to Apple, for example, and specify a flex grow of 2. So now the rate of growth of Apple is going to be twice the growth rate of the other divs. And by the way, this will override that, since Apple, or the styling of Apple, comes after that. All right. So what's happening here is that if we go back to the starting point, which is this one, then from this point, Apple is going to grow twice as much as the other flex items. So to make this clear, let's change the content of Apple and let's start from the starting point where our flex items are going to start growing. So from here, Apple is going to take twice more space than the other flex items once you start increasing the width of the Flexbox. So any remaining space is going to be distributed between all these flex items once I start increasing the width of the Flexbox, but Apple is going to take twice as much as the other flex items. So let's go ahead and start that. And you can see that Apple is becoming bigger and bigger, much bigger than the other flex items. And if I change the flex grow property of Apple to 4, for example, then that will become even more clear. And you'll see the rate of growth of Apple is going to become really more significant. Perfect. Now let's go back to the starting point where flex items start growing. Well, you can actually control that using another property, which is flex basis, and let's apply it to all divs. So if I set that to 200 pixels, this means that the flex basis of each of these flex items is going to be 200 pixels, and that's the starting point of growth. So if I reduce the width of the Flexbox to this point, where each of these flex items occupies 200 pixels for the width, then that's the starting point of growing. And you will see that if I decrease the width of the Flexbox, then a new line is going to be created earlier than before, because the flex basis has been reached here. Now, if you change the flex basis to 100 pixels, for example, then you'll be able to reduce the width further until you reach 100 pixels for each of these flex items. All right? All right, now let's make Apple grow at the same rate as the other flex items. Like that. So their starting point is 100 pixels, and they all grow at the same rate. So they all keep the same width all the time. Now, what if we want to be able to reduce the width of the Flexbox and shrink the flex items until they reach their minimum width instead of creating a new line? So at the moment, once we reach their flex basis, which is 100 pixels, then a new line is created. And just to differentiate between the minimum width necessary to fit the contents of these flex items and the flex basis, let's increase the flex basis slightly. So let's go for 150 pixels, for example. So that's our new flex basis. Okay, so the property we're going to be using here to make the items shrink further instead of creating a new line like this is going to be flex shrink. So for now, let's set it to 1 for all flex items and see what happens. Well, that's not exactly what we wanted, because once the width of the flex items reaches 150 pixels, then a new line is created. So the reason why we've got this is because we are still setting the container's flex wrap option or property to wrap. So we need to remove that, or just set that to no wrap, which is the default value, to make the flex items shrink once they reach their baseline or flex basis. All right. So now once they reach their flex basis of 150 pixels, then they will start shrinking until they reach their minimum width. Now, to see this clearly, let's remove the flex grow property so that they don't grow. Okay, and instead of centering them, let's go back to the justify content property and remove it. Now, at the moment, the width of each flex item is equal to its flex basis, which is 150 pixels. And to verify this, you can just change that to 200 and you'll see how that changes. All right. So we've got some remaining space because the width of the Flexbox is bigger than the sum of the widths of all these flex items, including any margins. Now, if I reduce the width of the Flexbox, at a certain point, the width of the container is not going to be enough to fit the width of all these flex items if they keep their width equal to their flex spaces. So what's going to happen, since they can shrink, their width is going to start decreasing until they reach their minimum width, which is necessary to fit their inner content. Now let's have a look at the value we chose for the flex shrink property. So we set the flex shrink to 1 for all flex items. Now let's go to Apple and set its flex shrink property to 2, for example. So this means that the shrinking rate of Apple is going to be twice the shrinking rate of all the other items. So once they start shrinking, Apple is going to shrink twice as much. And you can see that the width of Apple is becoming smaller than the width of the other items. But you will notice at some point that Apple will not be able to shrink anymore. And that's because it reached its minimum width, which is necessary to fit the contents of Apple. But the other items are going to continue shrinking because they haven't reached their minimum width yet, because their shrinking rate is smaller than Apple's shrinking rate. So they will continue shrinking until they reach their minimum width. All right. So again, we start from the flex basis and then we continue shrinking, Apple shrinking twice as much until Apple reaches its width first because it was shrinking faster. The other flex items keep shrinking until they also reach their minimum width, and then at that point we're not going to be able to shrink anymore and the elements will just overflow outside the Flexbox. Now what if I set the flex shrink property of Apple to 0? Well, in this scenario, Apple is not going to shrink anymore. So all the other items keep shrinking because we set their flex shrink property to 1 and they all shrink at the same rate, while Apple doesn't shrink at all below its flex basis. All right. So it's very important to note here that items start shrinking below their flex basis. And if we don't specify a flex basis, let's see what happens. So none of the flex items is shrinking, but let's have a look at what happens if we increase the content of one of these flex items. Well, Microsoft is now bigger, and let's reduce the width of the Flexbox and see what happens. Well, Microsoft starts shrinking until it reaches its minimum width, which is enough to fit its content. But once we've got plenty of space available, then instead of having a few lines inside the Flexbox, we've got only one line because we've got enough space to fit the content of the line. All right. So this Flexbox is actually shrinking because once you start reducing the width, it actually shrinks. But what if I go back and set the flex shrink property of all flex items to 0? Well, in this case, it doesn't shrink at all. And that's very important to note and understand. Normally, when you are designing websites, inside your flex items, you're not going to have a single word like that. You're going to have some text inside with some other elements probably, it's important to understand when your flex items are going to shrink or not. Okay, so let's go back to a flex shrink property set to 1. Let's make our items grow at the same rate. It's important to note that once you set the flex grow property to a value like 1 to any flex item inside a row, then any remaining space available inside that row is going to be occupied. And you can try that by setting the flex grow property of one single item to 1. So let's go to Facebook, for example. You can see that Facebook occupies any remaining space inside the row. If I go to the scenario where the Flexbox wraps its content, and I reduce the width to create an extra line, then you can see that we don't have any spaces remaining in the first row because we've got Facebook in that row, but the next row has got Amazon, and this flex item doesn't have a flex grow property set in our styling, so we still have got some remaining space there. Well, if I go back and set Amazon's flex grow property to 1, then since Amazon is in that row, then it's going to occupy any remaining space inside that row. And that's something very important to understand. All right? Perfect. Now let's go back to the flex basis and just make sure that you really understand how it works. So I'm going to go back to no wrap, and let's set the flex basis to 150 pixels. So when your flex items don't grow, like in this scenario, and you've got some remaining space there, then you know that that is the flex basis of your flex items. Okay, now if I remove that, then the flex basis is going to be the minimum width necessary to fit the content of these flex items, and it's going to differ from one flex item to the other. So if I go back to a flex grow of 1, then any remaining space is going to be occupied because items started growing starting from their flex basis. If I go back, then I can see clearly what the flex basis is for each of these flex items. And I can set that to 150 pixels if I want. All right, now let's set the flex grow to 1. So you've got 3 important properties that you really need to master in order for you to know how to use Flexbox in your projects. Now, instead of writing all these properties one by one, you can just write flex and set the flex grow first, then the flex shrink, then the flex basis like this. And this will have exactly the same effects as setting each of these properties separately.